Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Glendale Water and Power Commission. Today is February 8, 2010. Jackie, may we have roll call, please?
Commissioner Jemian? Here. Commissioner Armenian?
Present.
Commissioner Chan?
Present.
Commissioner Miller?
Present.
President Yao?
Present. Next item, please.
We're going to start with consent items. Motion to approve the minutes.
I would like to request that the approval of the minutes be postponed. I noted some errors recently, and they were a little bit too complex for me to get all written down.
Okay.
And I would like a little bit of time to do that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Do we have a second on the motion?
I second.
Should we vote on it? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Do we need a formal vote, Christine?
That's sufficient.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's see.
The next item, I think we're going to move the all communications up. Well, we have a press for time today. I think we have to be out here by 6, so I'll be moving item 4, all communications, up to this point. So for all communications, I'd like to invite Doug Caldwell to the podium, please.
Also, President Yao, would you like to note the 3-minute limit?
Yes. And for the public speakers, please note that there's a 3-minute limit, and Jackie will be monitoring that.
Yes.
Thank you. Go ahead. Mr. Caldwell?
Commissioners, I know that many of the comments that we received tend towards the negatives. I'd like to flip the sign on that and give some very positive feedback to the Commission and to the Department.
Your mic's not on?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I've spoken before on various solar topics. In the last year, I decided to kind of walk the talk, as it were, and got a solar system installed in my home. After getting a number of quotes, I decided to do it myself, partly because, I wanted to and get the experience. I got a lot of help along the way, a lot from Glendale Water and Power itself, some from the Building and Safety Department. I got some early help from Victor Morales with the design. The day of commissioning, I had the Building and Safety Inspector, Tio Tan, come out from Building and Safety. He came out at 9:50, I believe. The Glendale, the Water and Power Commissioner, or meter crew, Gil Arteaga, showed up at 9:55. The rest of the crew showed up at about 10:05. By 10:30, I was connected. Tom Hansen and Peter Milroy, one other guy on the meter crew, were just very helpful. We had a couple of comments, a couple of things to walk through. Everything went really, really smoothly. The biggest kudos, I would say, though, to Suzanne Daniels. She was very helpful in getting me through the reservation process. Gave me an extension to make sure that I had time, because after deciding to do it, obviously it was going to take a lot more time than I expected, and that the normal 6-month process would have allowed. I dropped off my paperwork on December 31st, and I received my check for the rebate last Saturday, a week ago. So very rapid. Contrast that to some of the other utilities I've heard stories about where, for instance, I was talking to a real installer after and talked about my experience. He's like, wow, we've had stories where a woman in another territory, I won't say which utility, got her system built, ready to be connected, and 3 months later she was still waiting to be connected. And of course the delays in getting rebates is legendary. So thank you all very much. Also, I wanted to say, since I believe that the members of the electrical system, Victor, Gil, and the meter crew all work for Ramon Abweg. I'd like to thank him for his leadership on that, and also Ned Basson for customer services, as Suzanne works for him. And Glenn Steger, thank you. It was really this end of it was really a pleasant process. I had plenty of problems getting the technical aspects done, but this wasn't one of them. So, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Great, thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Herbert Milano, please.
Thank you, President Yao, members of the GWP Commission, city staff, Mr. Steiger. My name is Herbert Milano. Last week, when the day after you postponed the regular scheduled meeting, the City Council took up an issue that I don't know if you came before you, which was the extension of the strategic plan contract. Since I'm not apprised as to whether or not it came before you, sometimes I'm concerned that when you cancel a meeting, then the City Council is taking up issues that did not come before you, and I don't think that is right if that was the case. I would like to suggest that if you were to have only one thing to do, it would be a review of the strategic plan, which is the most top-level direction that you can give the GWP. I had it before you some documentation concerning the electrical rates of the Glendale Water and Power, including comparisons with the city of Burbank, the city of Los Angeles, the city of Pasadena. I come before you several times, especially since 11 months ago, when there was a big demonstration in South Glendale concerning the high electrical rates. And since then, almost on a monthly basis, and presented it to the City Council as well. And are continually being challenged as to whether my information is accurate or not. So I have brought some documentation with you, including some additional documentation concerning the lawsuits against the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power by other governmental entities and other parties. What I would like to suggest is that if you could bring it up to a formal agendized item for a true review of what these rates are. It is my contention that they might be the very highest in Southern California, if not the whole state of California. There is an impact that is very significant to the number of people that are being impacted. If the document back in November the 12th said that 20,000 customers are in dire need of a break in the utility rate, it appears that the number is even much larger based upon the newsletter that came out in December that 23,000 customers requested some type of postponement of their electric bill. But if you were to look at the demographics in Southern Glendale, I would imagine that there could be a very large number, disproportionate, who are having a significant amount of time. I know that because my tenants are having a tough time meeting those high electrical bills. And I think that we need to review it so that we can take a look to see what kind of a break to provide. But the other burden that we have is a burden on the Glendale Unified School District. It's significant, especially after the legal case and the precedents that are here with regard to the burden that the school district has to carry, which in turn translates into teachers that need to be cut in order for them to actually meet their obligations, especially now with the severe budget cuts that are coming from the state of California. So I come to you as an appeal to really get an advocate for the rates for those individuals and families who are in dire need of a break with regard to the very high rates that we have. And I also provided for you the reasons why these rates are so high and the impact that we have with regard to the transfers of money from the Glendale Water and Power to the general fund. And I presented to you some basic information. The general fund of the city of Glendale, the overall budget, I should say, has doubled in the last 10 years. Population grew by 5%. The city's payroll, total payroll cost went up by 50%. The city's pension cost by 300%. And the city's medical insurance premiums by 500%. Not counting all of the millions upon millions of dollars in lawsuits that the city has had from employees suing the city and losing, when the city basically lost those cases. Look, the burden that cannot come out of the revenues from taxes, from property taxes and sales taxes, which have been insufficient to meet those expenses, have come out of another way, out of the Glendale Water and Power and the rate increases. And I think it is time for us to really take a good look and get an overall and comprehensive review of how these rates match with regard to the rest of the country and how it's impacting our schools and families in need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Milano. And I think we'll be discussing rates later on in the agenda. So hopefully that will answer some of your questions there. And another change in the agenda, I'd like to move item 3D, the legislative update, to before 3A. And then after that, we'll continue with the agenda as is. Ms. Haddad?
Mr. President and members of the board, Good evening, good afternoon. I just wanted to give you quickly, in a very brief nutshell, what is going on in Sacramento and D.C. On the regulatory front, California is moving ahead with the implementation of cap and trade through AB 32. The EAC's recommendations, which are outlined in the report, were heard on January 28th. California is also moving ahead with the 33% renewable electricity standard through AB 32 and CARB. That recommendation was heard before the CARB board on February 2nd. On the legislative front, the deadline for introducing new bills is actually February 19th, so I'll have more to report to you at the March meeting of this commission. The Senate bill, as I had informed you last month, is sure to be expected, but from the Chief Consultant of Utilities and Commerce Committee, they are looking to create an assembly vehicle as well to increase the chances of that passing on a legislative note as well. And from D.C., as you all are aware, security and the economy are the two top priorities as outlined by the President in the State of the Union, but clean energy remains a top administration priority as well. So we'll be hearing more from D.C. as the session continues. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Yes, I do, if I may. You mentioned that we're moving forward in cap and trade, and any expectation when that would actually come to vote?
2012, January 2012 is when they're looking for it.
Okay, all right, okay.
Two questions. I understand that on the federal level, the word on the street in D.C. is that the cap and trade is dead for at least this year. I don't know if you have anything you could add on that. And then second, I've also understand that there is a movement underway to postpone AB 32 taking effect until a jobless rate is reduced to 5.5%. Any assessment you have of that?
I'm hearing the same things from our contacts in D.C. with regards to cap and trade. The recent election in Massachusetts also shifted the balance of power a little bit between the two parties, and so this is a kind of splitting very much in partisan ways in D.C. With regards to postponing AB 32, the staff is moving ahead full steam. So if there's political pressure, it's not taking effect at the regulatory agency, so they're still moving forward.
Thank you.
Let me add to that. There is a move afoot to put a ballot initiative forth that would, in fact, delay the implementation of the cap and trade piece of AB 32 until there were 3 consecutive quarters of 5.5 or less unemployment in the state.
And I have a question about that. So the cap and trade might be postponed, but is there a reduction, the goal for greenhouse gas reduction is still proceeding per the different sectors that are mandated to reduce the greenhouse gas emission? Is that still correct?
Well, it would also change the goal of the reduction, and it's unclear as to exactly how that would change. What would not change, however, would be the current, and I emphasize the current, renewable portfolio standard requirements. But the proposed portfolio requirements could change. That's correct.
Any other questions, comments? Thank you, Mrs. Zara.
Thank you.
And I'll turn this over to General Steiger, General Manager Steiger, to continue the agenda items. Thanks.
Thank you. Our agenda today is fairly long in terms of 2 significant presentations, so I will defer any comment I have till next month. There's nothing important that needs to be discussed at this point from my perspective, so I would like to move to the next agenda item.
Next item, Customer and Support Services, RKS results from our Smart Grid Residential Survey, presented by David Reichman of RKS.
Projector.
Here we go.
Okay, good. Okay. President Yao and Commissioners, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. What I'm going to be talking about this afternoon is the results from GWP's Smart Grid Residential Benchmark. This was a survey that we conducted among residential customers of GWP about their awareness and their opinions about smart grid. This was done actually about a month ago, so these results are very, very current. And the purpose of the survey was really to get opinions and attitudes of customers about smart grid before there was any publicity or anything else, sort of getting a pure read. So I'm going to take you through these results, and please, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt. The goals of the project were really very straightforward. Provide a reading of smart grid, data and intelligence to assist the outreach efforts and communication support of GWB's Smart Grid program. That was the major part of the survey. While we were there, item number 2, we also asked some questions about customer awareness of an interest in the electric vehicle. So those were our marching orders. How did we do it? Most of the sample sizes of surveys that we do for GWP consist of 100 interviews, and those are pretty good at getting a reading of customer opinion. For this survey, we recommended, and GWP agreed, that we go to a larger sample size of 250 interviews. Why? Number 1, the statistical precision is better. And number 2, we have the ability to look at subgroups within the total. Customers, various groups of customers, high income, low income, middle income, old, young, to find out their awareness of an interest in smart grid. GWP provided us with a customer list, and that became the starting point for sample selection. We developed a questionnaire in consultation with GWP, and telephone interviews were conducted in December. So the results that you'll be seeing today are about a month old. GWP was identified as the sponsor of the research. Total of 250 interviews were conducted. The list included a flag, so we knew that the low-income participant, customers who were in GWP's low-income program, and that 25% of the customers are in that program. And in our sample, 19% of the people we actually interviewed came from were part of the low-income program. So we have a pretty good sample. Just one other interesting point. In the survey, we asked if customers have Internet access, and we found out that 76% of your residential customers have Internet access at the home. And we asked, how do they sign on? Basically, it's mostly through broadband, DSL, and cable modem. I think 90% of them sign on through a broadband connection. Okay. We started out by asking overall satisfaction, and this is just a question that we repeat in all of our surveys. And the most recent reading before this one was 18 months ago, June and July of 2008. And the question is, overall, how satisfied are you with the services provided by Glendale Water and Power on a 0 to 10 scale, where 0 is low and 10 is high? 70% 18 months ago said they were very satisfied. That number is up to 78% now. The mean, or the average across the entire distribution, went from 8.1 to 8.4. So my rule of thumb is anything that's in the 8s is a good reading. And in fact, GWP has gone up a little bit. It's not statistically significant, but numerically it's gone up. And this is a very, very difficult environment for all businesses. We do a lot of work with utilities around the country, and if utilities have flat readings during this period, that's considered good. So if anything, GWP has done well. We then started to get into smart grid, and this chart shows really three questions, and I'll read them. The first one, which is charted here, is thinking about how your household uses electricity and water. If 0 means your household could do a lot more to conserve electricity and water, and 10 means your household is doing all it can, what number along the 0 to 10 scale best describes how much your household conserves electricity and water? And what this says is 54% say that they're doing all they can, doing a lot to conserve electricity and water. The second one is, Now let's imagine that a system exists that gives you up-to-date information on the amount of electricity and water your household has used since the last bill and the cost of that electricity and water. If 0 means not at all useful and 10 means very useful, how useful is having this information available to you? And this is 58% say it would be very useful to have that information. This is sort of a kind of an overview description of a smart grid type of system, but we just put it into English. And the third question, was how concerned is GWP about helping customers like you manage your household's use of electricity and water more efficiently? Please use a 0 to 10 scale where 0 means GWP is not at all concerned and 10 means they're very concerned. And 58% say that GWP is very concerned with how the household uses electricity and water. So this sort of it starts to get us into some smart grid questions, which we'll pick up in a minute. How satisfied are customers with GWP's efforts at communicating with them about ways to conserve electricity and water? 62% in this most recent survey say they're very satisfied. The average is 7.6. We then asked customers about GWP's role in educating customers about the ways to manage electricity and water use in their home. And what 55% of residential customers in this most recent survey say GWP is very active, and 31% say GWP is fairly active. So that's 86%, almost 9 out of 10 customers who believe that GWP has been active. And when we say, what should GWP's role be in the future in terms of communicating and educating customers about ways to manage electricity and water use, 43% say GWP should be much more active than they are now. Another 34% somewhat more active, and you add those two together, that's 77%, 3 out of 4, who believe that GWP should be more active in the future. They should continue to be active in educating customers. GWP just started to introduce something called home energy reports. I think they just started mailing these out around the time of the survey. And what we found is that 36% of the customers say they actually recall receiving these reports. And when we asked these 36%, how useful is the information contained in these reports, 71% call it very useful. Now, we do a lot of work for utilities on energy efficiency and a lot of stuff. These are terrific numbers. I mean, there's so much stuff out there on energy efficiency, and most of it really is kind of dull and pablum. For 71% of the customers to say this is very useful, it means they remembered it, it means they're excited about it. This is a really very good score for a new program. That's just my own editorializing. Then we got into the questions about smart grid, and this was really a kind of we call this unaided awareness. Have you seen, heard, or read anything recently about the smart electric grid? 26% say yes, and which means 71% say no. They've never seen a smart grid. They wouldn't know one if they met one on the street. It means nothing to them. So 26% really have some familiarity about it. We then did what's called aided awareness, and we read them this description. As a way of helping customers better manage, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong question. Yes, okay. As a way of helping customers better manage and control their electricity and water use, GWP will be installing new smart grid technology to Glendale's electric and water service. If 0 means not a good idea, and 10 means a very good idea, how good an idea do you think it is that GWP install a smart grid in Glendale? Well, 54% after this definition say they think it's a very good idea, and another 25% said they weren't sure, which means that everybody else is kind of in the middle, but still half the customers responding that it's a very good idea just on the basis of a definition, when 3/4 of them don't know what a smart grid is, mean that they're kind of open, interested, kind of excited by the concept. We then went on and tested 5 features that a smart grid might offer. Let's start here on the right because that's the highest number. This chart shows the percentage of the percentage of customers. Actually, on a 0 to 10 scale, the number of customers who say there's a great deal of benefit. There's benefit to smart grid. So the way the question was asked is on a 0 to 10 scale, if 0 means no benefit at all and 10 means a great deal of benefit, how do you regard the amount of benefit to each of these features that I'll be reading? And the first one is the ability to see how much electricity your household has used today. This is 7.7 on a 0 to 10 scale, which means that is very respectable in terms of a feature that customers believe has a benefit. This one, the second one, is the ability to see a table or a chart containing your household's hourly electricity use for the previous month. 7.5 on a 0 to 10 scale are saying that has benefit. The third one is the ability to select the day of the month your GWP bill is due. 7.2 on a 0 to 10 scale. See benefit to that. The fourth one is a little bit lower. Getting charged lower electric rates in exchange for voluntarily allowing GWP to make small adjustments to your thermostat during high peak usage. That's a little bit lower at 6.2. And finally, the last one is getting charged electric rates that vary with the time of day. That means paying lower rates for using electricity during off-peak periods and being charged higher rates for using electricity during peak periods. That's a little bit lower. But if you look at these together, again, nobody's ever seen a smart grid. Nobody really knows what it is. These are fairly respectable interest levels. I mean, you're obviously not going to sell these right out of the box, but in terms of conceptualizing, these are really quite respectable readings. We then ask customers, thinking about the features I just mentioned that are available through smart meters, if 0 means no help at all and 10 means a great deal of help, how much do you think these features will help you actively manage your household's use of electricity and water? 60% of the total, 6 out of 10, say it's a great deal of help. Among those who are on the low-income plan, it's a little bit lower, but it's over half. We also asked about the value of being able to monitor electricity usage anytime that you want to. And when we put it this way, 63% of total customers believe there's a great deal of value in having this capability versus 8% who just dismiss it. Among low-income plan customers, it's still a majority. Among those who recall the home energy reports, it's almost 3/4. And among those who are interested, who later on say they're very interested in signing up for smart grid, it's almost 4 out of 5. This is the bottom line question. This is the question that really kind of separates the men from the boys. How interested? The way the question was worded. If GWP offered smart meters to customers at no cost, how interested would you be in signing up for this? Please use a 0 to 10 scale where 0 means not at all interested and 10 means very interested. Well, 60% say I'm very interested. Another 24% are somewhat interested. That adds to 84% versus about, 1 in 6 who say they're not at all interested and 13% are not sure. So again, nobody has seen a smart grid. We're talking about a concept. There's a great deal of interest that kind of captures customers' excitement about this concept. And I believe that this reflects the credibility of GWP. I mean, I think that a lot of utilities are offering this. Some are more interested than others. For something that's gotten no publicity, it's really just sort of a concept in a survey. These are good numbers and reflect positively on GWP, in my opinion.
Mr. Reichman, may I ask a question about that?
Sure.
Just for clarification, what did you really mean by signing up for smart grid? Because it's not like people are going to have a choice. Smart grid is coming. It's an infrastructure, more of an infrastructure
Understood.
issue. How did you explain that?
What we meant by that was that everybody's going to be wired. Everyone's going to have a smart meter, but some customers are going to be more involved than others in monitoring their use and actually using the capabilities of the meter. to me, it's up to GWP to kind of bring those in and make them feel that they are participating in a program. I mean, some percentage of the customers are not going to do anything, and you'll leave them alone. Some customers are going to be in the middle, and some customers are the low-hanging fruit. You want to get them involved. You need to reach out to them, communicate. When their bills don't go down, you need to, and they complain, you need to tell them why. What else you can be doing. It's a constant outreach, marketing, communications program. So I looked at participation as the GWP outreach effort that will really support this program and make it successful.
So you just use smart definition and smart grid from the perspective, what you really meant is the customer programs that'll be offered, not signing up for
Yes,
smart grid.
right. Everyone will have a meter, but if this is going to be successful, I mean, in my opinion, a lot of utilities around the country are getting involved in smart grid, smart meter, but many, if not most, are kind of making the customer forgotten. It's the last thing to worry about. We're worried about the hardware. We're worried about buying the meters. We're worried about getting the systems together. Oh, customers. Oh, yes, that's right, the customers. Many utilities that we do business with kind of forget that customers are going to make this more successful. And so participation, Commissioner, means, to my way of thinking, is the outreach that GWP provides to bring them in to reinforce their conservation and their monitoring efforts. Did I answer your question? This is fascinating. We asked, okay, what bothers you about smart grid? What are the 2 or 3 things that bother you? And this is open-ended. This is volunteered. We didn't suggest anything. What's going to prevent you from signing up? Well, the first thing to notice is that 41% down at the bottom, you see where my marker is, 41% say, I have no concerns. The 41% are really not concerned about anything. 13% say they need to know, that's the top one, this 13%, I need to know the cost involved. Will there really be a savings? 6% complain about privacy and security. 6% say I'm not the homeowner, I'm in an apartment, and will this apply to me? 5% are concerned about GWP controlling it. I don't want to lose control. 4% need to know more. 4%, the installation, the interruption during the installation, is there going to be a power outage? 3%, new technology. I don't trust new technology. There are going to be technology problems. 3% say I'm just not interested. 2% are concerned about the accuracy. 2% how to use it. The most interesting thing to me is that if I had asked each of you individually, as we did at GWP this afternoon, where would privacy, how many people would volunteer privacy as a concern, you would have probably said 30, 40, 50% would have raised it, and only 6% raise it. It doesn't mean it won't be a concern, but it means that if GWP can start to communicate now, it can be neutralized as a concern. So I think this is a very doable introduction from my perspective, having seen a lot of these. Okay. Anything more about smart grid? Would I go on to electric cars? Any questions or comments about smart grid? Okay. We asked 2 or 3 questions about electric cars because they were topical. I should probably read you how we describe them because everybody, and thank God this wasn't asked now with Toyota's problems with the Prius, but these were asked in December. Automobile manufacturers are planning to introduce electric cars into the marketplace. These are cars that use only electric power as their main fuel and feature plug-in charging to replenish the battery. These differ from hybrid cars that use electric power and some small amounts of gasoline as a secondary source. These new electric-only cars will be available for sale starting in 2010. How interested are you personally in learning more about electric cars? If 0 means not at all interested and 10 means very interested, what number describes your interest? Now, we wanted to make sure that they didn't get the hybrids confused. It was really plug-in electric vehicles. 42% of total GWP customers are very interested, another 28% are interested, about a quarter are not interested. The higher income, it's up to 46% and 27%. Among college graduates, it's 49%. So there's excitement and interest in this technology. And when we ask the question, I don't have a chart for it, when we ask the question, how likely are you to buy or lease an electric vehicle when it comes out, we found 18% of GWP residential customers say they are very interested. 18%. Now, 18%, I mean, I wouldn't take that to the bank, but you could take that number and cut it in half and cut it in half again. So it's 4.5%, 5% of the customers. If they all live in one neighborhood and plug in at the same time, there goes the grid. I mean, the fact of the matter is that customers are really interested in this concept. And when you ask them, these are the people who said they were very likely to acquire, when will you buy one? When will you acquire one? Well, 15% say sometime in 2010. Another 25% say sometime in 2011. So you add these two together, and it's about 40% of those who say they're interested. And about half of them say 2012 or later. So really, the message from the electric car from this first beginning survey that we've asked anywhere is that it's coming. And there's a lot of excitement surrounding it, and there's going to be impacts on the electric grid and on GWP and everyone. So, my time is running out. Just
quick question
yes,
on the
sir.
last slide.
Yep.
Is this the last slide?
Well,
previous slide.
Yep.
Is this the percentage of the entire 250, or is it a percentage of the people that were interested?
These are the people who are interested when they're going to buy it. Because remember, only about 18% of the 250 expressed high levels of interest.
So this is a percentage of 18%?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah, so it's qualified to that group.
Okay.
Okay, just, this really just summarizes the customer satisfaction is improving. Residential customers offer, some of these charts I didn't show you because I was told that we really didn't have the time. So just the stable value assessments, having up-to-date, the concept of having up-to-date information is useful. 58% believe GWP is very concerned about helping customers. 62% are satisfied with the GWP's efforts to communicate. The bottom, 86% call GWP's role active. 76% want GWP to be even more active in the future. A third recall the home energy reports, and 71% of them label it very useful. The smart grid unaided recall is 26%. When you give them an explanation, 54% think it's a very good idea. 5 smart grid features that we tested find respectable appeal. 60% believe it will help them actively manage their use of electricity and water. 73%, we didn't get into this, but 73% are interested in having GWP send an alert. 63% find a great deal of value in being able to monitor their use in their own homes anytime they can. 3/4 say having this option would make them more active in monitoring the use. 84% are interested in signing up. And not knowing the cost savings is a major obstacle, with privacy and control mentioned as minor obstacles. For electric vehicles, 70% are interested, and 18% say they're very likely to buy or lease, and 15% in 2010, 25% in 2011, and half 2012 or later. So just in terms of conclusions, and this is really, from our perspective, we think that GWP starts its smart grid project with a very strong base of customer satisfaction and credibility. And in fact, that's what we're really reflecting here, because customers, as I said, never met a smart grid. They don't know it, they've never seen it, but they're trusting that it's going to provide them with benefits to help them conserve. And if GWP was not performing on the trust and credibility dimensions, you wouldn't see these numbers. Secondly, they praise GWP's role and, in fact, want to see it expanded. It's been a long time since we've seen numbers like that anywhere. And third, there's a measurable level of excitement surrounding the smart grid project, and we think that this is something that the utility can build upon. And finally, electric vehicles, a high level of interest and anticipation, and a measurable likelihood of acquiring. And that's my report to you this afternoon.
Thank you. That was a very helpful presentation. I was a little bit surprised that you had a 5% difference, if I understood correctly, between the number of people in your sample who were in lower income brackets versus the population. And I wanted to ask what measures you took to ensure that your sample was representative of the customer base.
Actually, the sampling error of a sample of 250 has a sampling error about plus or minus 6.2. So
okay.
We're sort of within that margin.
Okay, all right, so that was kind of a test then. All right.
And the other, but to answer your question directly, what we look at is how the demographics are represented from survey to survey. And the best way to look at whether we have a good reflection of reality is to look at that first customer satisfaction question. That first question in the presentation, remember, it went from 8.1 to 8.7.
8.7.
Here, I'll just tell you. The reason I say that is, I'm sorry, I have it right here. It went from 8.1 to 8.4.
Okay.
Well, we remember the last survey we did was 18 months ago. If we got 3.2 now, we'd say we don't have a good sample. Well, we got something sort of within range. It sort of lends credibility to the whole process. The numbers, in other words, when you do utility surveys time after time, these are institutions that customers know intimately. They have opinions about them, so the trend should be smooth trends. They shouldn't be huge ups and downs. And in the surveys that we've done for GWP over the years, they have changed, but not huge fluctuations.
And you mentioned that there had been this increase, I think, from 8.1 to, I thought it was 8.7, but you say
it went from
8.4.
8.1 to 8.4 in overall satisfaction.
And the error on that would be?
That's
how much?
probably not statistically significant.
Okay.
That's probably within, yeah.
So we can't really conclude that there was an
You can say that you're doing as well, if not
Okay.
better. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
All
what.
right.
And anything in the 8s is really at the upper end of the scale and is a good score.
Understood. Thank you.
I have one question.
Yes, sir.
To what degree do you have a cut of this data that would demonstrate if there's any sort of gaps with specific population groups, ethnic population groups within the city? I don't know how much you're aware, but over 50% of the city is a member of one ethnic group or another, and there are sometimes language barriers or higher hurdles to communicating. And since the purpose of this survey and research is to identify and inform the communication efforts, so in the spirit of having an effective program, outreach program, do you have any sort of analysis from that perspective?
Well, usually in many surveys, we ask questions about ethnicity. When we started working for GWP probably 7-8 years ago, we used to ask an ethnicity question, and there were a lot of complaints. Why do you want to know this? Why are you asking this? So we stopped asking it. So we don't have that because we were told that tended to that people tended to react negatively to that. But we could put it back in, but you're probably going to get some negative questions about it. So we don't have that question in there.
So in the surveying work that you did you encounter any sort of language barriers when you did that, particularly in the low-income brackets?
The answer is no, we haven't, no. I mean, what happens is that people answer the survey or they don't. I mean, some people, in other words, to complete 250 interviews, you don't make 250 calls. You make many more. But some people refuse. Some people have language problems. In some areas, we use bilingual Spanish-English interviews. We haven't done that here in Glendale, but in some places we do that. So we could do that in the future, but translate the surveys. But we haven't really had a problem with language barriers in Glendale. What happens is when we send interviews out, the interviews are conducted from Southern California. They're done actually in a suburb of Los Angeles is where the interviewing agency is located. And if we get a high number of language problems, they tell us, your sample is not working this time. You have a high number of people who are refusing because of language barriers. And we note that, and we say we have to solve that the next time, or we have to solve it this time. That has never come up in the Glendale surveys.
Thank you.
Well, I have a few questions.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for a great presentation, by the way, Mr. Reichman.
Thank you.
I have a few-part question. How often are these surveys going to be done as we move forward?
Well, there are really two types of surveys. One of them is kind of the normal customer satisfaction surveys that we tend to do a residential survey every other year, and 2010 would be the normal time to do that, and that's done in conjunction with the California Municipal Utilities Association. And we'll be doing a business survey as part of that as well. But the surveys that relate to smart grid are really going to depend upon the introduction of that program, because there's a whole research piece that's involved with the outreach. And I think that once you have a pilot in place, and I think Craig tells me that those installations are going to be taking place a little later on in the spring, we will probably do some surveying among the targeted households. And then when the full installation occurs, then we'll be surveying as part of that.
Because part of the interest for smart grid or smart meter is understanding the impact of it.
Yes.
And I think, as you mentioned in the survey, that people are not aware of what's going on, and then when they get aided, then they might think that there's a benefit to it. But as they hear more about the smart meter and smart grid and maybe the negative effect of it, I'll be interested in knowing, when we do those type of surveys, after the effect of the pilots from other utilities are doing, and how that would impact their view of what the smart meter and smart grid would be for Glendale. And so I'll be interested to maybe have a follow-up.
We are finishing up a project in Burbank, and I know they're going to be, because that was done through SCAPA, and so I know they're going to be sharing the results with you as you have shared the results with them. So there will be some cross-fertilization on that.
Right. And my other issue is, do we have a plan in place in GWP or a smart meter plan where we lay out the framework, where what we will do and what we won't do? Because I know there's some issues with the IOUs on getting in hot water for the smart meters, because they can remotely disconnect somebody or they can remotely reconnect somebody. So those are the type of issues that we hopefully can resolve before we roll it out and customers get confused and get worried because they might be disconnected remotely. Are those issues being addressed?
I'm sure they have, but I haven't.
The answer is yes. In fact, we have a very formalized plan as to what we will and won't do. And in fact, part of our plan is exactly that. That is part of the benefit. Certainly, it's a major cost benefit for smart grid to have remote connect-disconnect. That's correct.
But is that the policy? I guess maybe that's the decision that the city council can make, is maybe to not do a remote disconnect because of the concerns of people not understanding what it's all about, or they don't have the money to pay. Maybe they should have the options to work it out with the utility. Is that the option?
Well, at this point, we've not gone in that direction, unless Tammy wants to address that.
President Yao, members of the Commission, Tammy Valier, Customer Services Administrator. We have taken the remote disconnect, reconnect option under consideration, and the residential meters that we are ordering do have the remote disconnect and reconnect. We've discussed it as a utility as far as not increasing, especially immediately, the number of disconnects that we can do. Right now we have a certain number that we disconnect on a daily basis. We don't plan to increase that immediately. Maybe 1 year, 2 years out, we may increase as needed. Customers right now do have the option of contacting us before we disconnect. It's on the back of their bill. We offer payment arrangements. We give them plenty of notice.
Okay. Well, I just want to bring up the issue because a lot of the utilities are facing the same issues. A lot of customers are being turned off because even though they get those notices and they get those notifications over a period of time, but they still don't understand that this can be happen to them unless somebody comes out there and knocking the door. So having this feature to remotely disconnect the customer is very powerful and can be very concerning to a lot of customers. And it might show on the survey as the future when people hear about these things. So that's something that maybe the utility should be more aware of and be more cognizant of as we move forward. And maybe some of the surveys that the questions that we can ask in the survey in the future can reflect that.
And I do believe that we'll be proactive in letting customers know how our business may change, that the remote disconnect and reconnect is also not only just for the disconnect, but for also move-ins and move-outs. So it can be very beneficial, especially for landlords as well that don't want to pay the in-between usage for tenants.
Right.
Well, there was a moratorium put in place by the CPUC for the IOUs, and I know that there's an OIR issued right now, and that issue is being investigated pretty significantly across the state. Obviously, it doesn't affect GWP because it's not under CPUC jurisdiction. However, it would be very informative to follow that issue to inform any sort of decisions that GWP may make on this issue moving forward. As President Yao mentioned, that could impact the receptivity to the program if it's framed incorrectly in the future. So,
Agreed, and we do look at what is happening with the PUC as well.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, go ahead.
One more follow-up question. Is there a policy in place now? What will be the amount of time allowed from the time that customer's bill is unpaid to the time that the customer gets disconnected? Is there timing in place right now?
There is. A customer's bill is due 19, and we follow pretty much what most of the utilities follow. A bill is due 19 days from the bill date. Around day 23, we send a reminder notice. Around day 38, we send the final notice of disconnection, and a customer is eligible to be disconnected on day 45. So it's 45 days from the bill date. We also make a follow-up phone call. If we have a good phone number, we have a outbound dialer that calls and lets the customer know that we have an important message for them. And many times that's when people call and make a payment arrangement.
Right. And that policy is not changing going to the grid system. Very good.
And that's for residential only, right?
No, that's for all customers.
Oh, okay, commercial as well?
Commercial as well. Monthly accounts by monthly accounts. It's the same schedule.
Okay.
I have one last issue that I wanted to highlight and make a suggestion for the GWP's consideration, and that is I am very concerned about the adoption of smart grid and the programs and services, most particularly they're going to come afterwards, and that is where we will realize the benefits of the big investment and all the hard work. And so I find it hard to believe that in the lower income category that there is a full understanding of this equal to the level as portrayed in the survey. And so I would suggest that there be some consideration be given in terms of what sort of in-language outreach there might be done to different ethnic demographics within the city for the sake of success of the program, particularly in the lower income, because I think as you go into the higher income, there's more integration of those populations within the general customer base. But I think if you were to look more closely at a lower income demographic, you will find less understanding and probably less adoption of the programs. And of all the people that need some sort of mechanisms for controlling costs, it's those really who are on the lower income side of the scale versus the higher income scale, although we can all participate in that effort. So I would suggest for the GWP's consideration that they look at this particular program a little bit differently and try and go a little bit deeper into the understanding the customer base and the outreach efforts that might ensue as a result. And would it be possible to get a copy of the what was presented today?
Sure. Absolutely.
Any other questions or comments? If not, then I have a speaker for this item. I'd like to invite Mr. Herbert Milano, please.
Thank you very much. GWP Commissioners and City staff, my name is Herbert Milano. I don't know how to begin this process because I feel awfully frustrated. I know you asked some of the pertinent questions, and I really liked the follow-up many of you did. But there's something very simple here with regard to validating, as Mr. Miller asked, with regard to how do you validate that this survey was done appropriately. And it's very easy to basically look at two control numbers. You have the number of percentage of Armenians in the city, 30%. You have the number of renters in the city, 62%. So if the numbers were chosen at random, you can very easily look at the data and see if it basically follows through. If you don't, then you don't have a properly conducted survey. And I, from my inkling, from what I've seen in the answers to your questions, I don't believe you have one. I've done enough campaigns in Glendale, 3 of them, not my own necessarily, and I know what it is to make random calls. And I know a significant number of Armenians out there that will be reaching that would not be able to speak with me, in English, and a significant number as well who would be speaking in Spanish would not be able to communicate. So here's the question. What kind of policies do you generate out of this presentation? Where's the benefit for you to go forward with this thing? Is the objective really to improve the image of the city, or is the objective really to improve the knowledge of what this is? It's a little bit of epistemology here. You have, on the one hand, you have the circle, which is the impressions that you have, and on the other one, you have the data and the truth. And where they intersect is where you have knowledge. Well, what knowledge do we have here? When this thing is implemented, the tenant's going to be able to say, do I save costs here? Are the costs under my control? And if the data says that 20% of the people have access to the internet, what about that 20%? Will you put into place a process by which leaves out 20% of the population? I wouldn't do it. It's a significant chunk of people that are being left out if the internet access is the only access for people to monitor their process. In Canada, they've done it effectively in a very simple way. There's a device right there by their front door where they actually can see how much they're actually using day to day, hour by hour, with the cost associated with it. It doesn't take rocket science. It doesn't take the internet. It doesn't take anything significant. But it's incredibly valuable in doing what you want to do, energy conservation. So that is my question. How do you know that you're actually reaching the people that really matter and the people who are impacted financially, and what's the outreach? My thinking is that I think one of the commissioners mentioned it. The approach should be start with the individuals that are the most difficult to reach and really try to understand to see if they will benefit from it, and they can have the information that they can say to the decision, yeah, this thing that the city is coming forward with is going to benefit me, or is going to benefit the environment, and so forth. I think that there's a lot more problems, but I wish that the data would become available, at least so they can see the names, and you can pick them at random and validate for yourselves to see if it's really random as it is stated it is. Thank you.
Any comments?
Yes, I'd just like to add one comment. Mr. Milano is correct in that not everyone has access to Internet, and that's why we will be providing an in-home readout, as you've mentioned, as they do in other places, for that very purpose. So, yes, that all customers will have that.
If I may, I would also like to ask, I believe this study was preliminary to actually conducting a pilot. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, and so the pilot is actually going to go a lot more towards validating whether this technology was really beneficial to the utility.
Well, the pilot will validate the actual technology.
But presumably also that you'll be studying to what extent the pilot enables further conservation and so forth.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Well, and I also understand that we have a consultant on board that's going to handle the outreach portion of the smart grid project.
We do, yes.
Right. So,
yes, we do.
So the outreach will be improved.
Yes.
And just one more question. If the pilot is favorable, we expand in a phased approach with this. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. So at any point, if it turns out that we're seeing a negative return on investment at some point, we have a chance to halt the program and look at it.
We could, although to monitor negative return on investment as you're installing it is very, very difficult to do.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Commissioner Chan just mentioned, which is on the outreach. I know we have a consultant on board, but that consultant is not from the city of Glendale. That consultant is not from Southern California. And so what I would like to see, and I still don't have confidence in, is to make sure that there's appropriate understanding within the outreach programs that account for the audiences that outreach program is aimed at. And so I hope we'll have an opportunity where my confidence can be increased in the future as that program is defined and conducted, where we could demonstrate, or GWP could demonstrate, that it is taking into account some of these issues that I think have been raised today. I'm sure the intent is there. I just hope we'll actually see some demonstrable steps in that regard.
Any other comments or questions? Thank you. Next item, please, Sheila. Jackie.
Item 3C, Finance, Electric and Water Financial Update and Rate Slide Presentation.
I would like to introduce Bill Fox, who is our Assistant General Manager of Finance and Risk Management. Mr. Fox will present more or less of a financial overview today, leading specifically to a rate comparison, as you've requested, and rightly so. And just as a preface to Mr. Fox's comments, I'd like it to be known that, yes, we have been concerned, as all utilities are, but certainly we are, on the relative level of particularly our electric rates. Our staff has worked diligently over the last year to two to first stabilize the electric rates and now to reduce them. As we mentioned last month, we've had a reduction in rates. The presentation you see today will give a fairly good, comprehensive understanding of a number of our financial and statistical comparisons, but more so, it goes to the heart of the fact that our rates are not, as has been claimed, the highest in the state or the highest in the country, nor even are they the highest within the range of our Southern California neighbors. We certainly, in some cases, are higher than average, no question about that. You'll see this, but we think we have made good progress towards starting to stabilize and reduce our rates. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Fox, who will elaborate.
Thank you, Mr. Steiger. President Yao and Commissioners, I'd like to spend a few minutes today talking about the financial overview, and then we'll go into some rates and then some next steps that we're planning on taking. The presentation today will be based in two parts. Part one is the electric rate discussion, and part two will be water. We feel that it's necessary really to show both sides of the business today. Before we really get started, I thought we'd go through a financial overview, and this is for our fiscal year that just ended June 30th, 2009. If you can see, we broke our operation into the electric side and the water side, and in total, our margin for both sides of the business was 3.3%. Our electric margin was 3.2%, and our water margin was 4.1%. Of special note, we broke out the expenses and transfer separately so you could see the impact. GWP is a major contributor to the city and the resources that are required to run the multiple programs that the city has. And in total, the transfer that we made this past year was $23.3 million. Coming up for this year, our budget is also to remain at the same level, unless we get direction otherwise. In talking about the electric overview today, we're going to cover four components: the financial and operational information. We're going to do two rate comparisons. We're going to do a residential rate comparison, and then we're also going to do a small commercial rate comparison. Then we're going to talk about how the electric rate is developed. There are three different components in the development process. And then finally, we'll end up with the challenges and opportunities that face us. First off, on the electrical financial trend, we thought it would be important to kind of give you an overview of the last 3 years of our operation. As you can see, the last 3 years of our operation, we have a very small percentage margin that we're operating on. If you go back to 2007, we barely made a profit at all. If you go back to 2009, we're at 3.2%. The city transfer has been relatively slightly increasing each year, but the direction so far for this coming fiscal year will remain the same at $19.1 million. We thought it would be beneficial to break down the electric revenues to give you some sort of sense as to how the revenues are created. 87% of our revenues are from retail sales. Those are sales to our customers. The next biggest portion is our wholesale operation, which is 9% of our operation. So collectively, when you take a look at the two, it's the largest portion of what we have. We have been very aggressive in the grant area, and I think that that's something as a result of the efforts. Anytime there's a grant that's out there that we can take advantage of, we will try to write it and try to qualify for it. On the expense side, this past year, we had $209.5 million. The biggest portion of that was in our production side, and the production is primarily the generation of our electricity as well as the purchase power that we have. So you can see 68% is that, and then 9% is related to the transmission and distribution. And again, 9% or $19.1 million is related to the city transfer. The actual sources of our production of electricity, which is what we talked about before, which is over 60%, is broken down into three components. We have the jointly governed organizations, and this is primarily our SCAPA relationship. So we're getting most of our 49% of our power is coming from SCAPA. We are also purchasing power on long-term contracts, which is the other 36%, and then our own generation from our Grayson Power Plant provides 15% of the overall power production. Over the past 3 years, you can see that there is a slight trend change that is occurring. If you take a look and you compare most recently the 2008 fiscal year versus the 2009 fiscal year, we had a 7.4% reduction in the power being produced. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail, but it's primarily related to the fact that the wholesale side of the business isn't producing as much as required, and that's really the downturn, why there's been a downturn or decrease in the production. To give you a kind of a feel of who our customers are, we wanted to break them out into the various classifications. As you can see, the residential customers are the lion's share. They represent 85% of the customers for GWP. Other sister utilities will have different numbers than us, but this, for our sake, is 85% of our customers are the residents that live here. The 3-year trend, as you can see, shows that we're relatively consistent. We're a built-out city, and so you're not going to see many changes that occur from year to year. We decided to drill down one step from the total meters down to just concentrate on the residential meters themselves. And as you can see, we have different classifications of residential meters. 84.2% are customers that do not have any kind of form of rate subsidization. But more significantly, 15.8% of our customers do receive one form or another of a subsidized rate as a result of them meeting certain special criteria. In taking a look at the megawatt hour sales by classification, we wanted to show you that in looking at the overall trend that's occurring for GWP, that the sales are from year to year not varying significantly for our residential side of the business, but on the wholesale side of the business, we have seen a marked decrease when you compare 2008 to 2009. That's an 18% decrease. And that's primarily the result of two factors. One is that we try very hard to get involved. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. We're trying very hard to make deals on the wholesale side that are profitable. And so in many cases, you may not make a deal just for the result of making a deal with purpose. So the fact that the wholesale numbers are less doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. It just means that the opportunities in the marketplace aren't as consistent. When you look at sales to other utilities, the number, for example, under 2008-9, the 76,272, what that represents is when we look at our total production requirements, we in essence had excess capacity, and then we will sell that excess capacity to other utilities within the system. So it would be to our sister utilities. But overall, if you look at the trend from 2008 to 2009, we see a 3.9% decrease. Next, we're going to do two rate comparisons. We're going to do a residential comparison, and then we're going to do a small commercial comparison. In comparing electric rates, what we did is each month, LADWP does a survey, and it's done on behalf of SCAPA. And LADWP goes out and they survey the customer rates for each of these utilities. We participate with SCAPA and with LADWP in our rate comparison. This rate comparison is at the 500 kWh rate. This represents a typical residence in Glendale. So you're talking about a single-family residence rate. We stack up fairly well. If you can see that the 7-utility average is $68.41 per month, based at 500 kilowatt hours per month. We are slightly higher. We're $1.11 per month higher, or 1.6% higher than the average. But if you take a look, we sit, of the 7 different utilities, we sit right in the middle. There's 3 above us, and there's 3 below us. The second comparison is a small typical business at the 2,000 kilowatt hours per month rate. And this is, in fact, again, from the same survey data provided by LADWP to SCAPA. And it shows in this case that we don't fare quite as well as we did on the residential side. Under the 7 utility average, the rate would be $273.52 per month, and the city of Glendale is actually at $291.12 per month, or we're $17.60 per month higher, which is 6.4%. So in this case, the only one that's higher than us is Riverside. So this definitely has an impact on how we look at future rate designs when we stop to take a look at how we did on the commercial side versus the residential side. In performing the rate development process, excuse me, there's 3 components that you have to take a look at. There's the base rate, the fuel adjustment rate, and then the public benefits charge. All 3 of these components make up your total kilowatt hour rate. So we'll talk about each one of these components so that you have an idea of what the process is that we go through when we make a rate change. And taking a look at the first component, the fuel cost adjustment, that is done by what you call an administrative action. An administrative action means it doesn't require having to go to City Council for approval. What it does, it means that it has to go to the city manager for approval and not go through the City Council approval process. In this particular case, we are maintaining on a monthly basis our actual expenses and revenues, and we have actual reports that will identify where we are. What we end up having to do is compare our actual results to our forecasts, which is what we use to make our rates. If we find out that our rates do not have any major fluctuation between forecast and actual, then we don't have to make any kind of a rate adjustment or change. At that point, we notify City Manager's office and the Finance Director, and no rate change is being proposed. If, in fact, a rate change has to be proposed, then what we do is we do what's called scenario analysis. We will look at multiple different cuts of the data to try to come up to the right level of a revenue requirement, whether it's an increase or decrease, to make sure that we're not over-collecting or under-collecting on our fuel costs. This scenario analysis is done when, in fact, we need to make a rate change. Rate changes are done once every 6 months. So we go through and we look at the analysis, and if we have to make a change, it'll be done. If not, no change will be made. But in either event, there's a process where the city manager is notified, as well as the finance director, of any kind of a change that's required. Thank you. The second component in putting the rates together is what's called your base rate adjustment. Your base rate adjustment actually does require City Council approval. The first step is to identify what's called your revenue requirement, and that's basically figuring out what your expenses are, and it's primarily your O&M expenses, as well as your transfer and any recurring capital requirements, to come up with what's called a net revenue requirement. What we do is we compare what our net revenue requirement is to what we've already forecasted, and if in fact the number is in sync and no adjustments required, then we don't have to do anything else. We just leave the rate as it is. However, if we find out that we're either in an over-collected or under-collected position, then we have to go through a funding analysis, and that requires a lot of input from several different sources, one of which is the Commission themselves. We would be coming before the Commission. We would share with you the results of our findings. We would get input from you. We would also receive input from staff, and from there we would go to the city manager to share with him the results. Ultimately, the city manager would then agree or disagree with the results, and there may be a do loop in there until we get it to the point that it's the correct rate. And then finally, it would go to City Council for their final review and approval. Through this process, it's very well vetted out, so there's multiple people looking at it and a lot of scrutiny that goes on this, a lot of public scrutiny that goes along with it. in the end, City Council will make the final decision on whether a rate change, either up or down, would be appropriate.
And is this annually? Do you do that?
What we do is we look at this on a every 6-month basis. Whether we need to go through and make a change, it would only be as required. We will be going through this. We went through this first analysis effective in December. We looked at it for January, and we found that there was no need to change the base rate. Prior to July 1st, we will be going back and we will do another look at it to see if, in fact, a rate change is required. The third component is the public benefits rate, and the public benefits rate is really a calculation. It's taking the sum of our other two base rate and our fuel rate, and it's multiplying it by 3.6%. This, in turn, allows funds that are used for the various programs that the city has in place in order to perform energy efficiency as well as other public benefit programs. Through our program, we do report to the state of California on an annual basis, and we design our programs to make sure that they meet state requirements, and we do the funding, but we do maintain the local control of our own programs. I guess this slide here is to pretty much let you know that putting rates together is not an easy task. It's taking into account the fact that there are a number of different things that you have to take a look at. In developing your rates, you want to take a look at the risks that you're willing to assume and what your priorities are as far as serving the community and making sure that the rates are reflective of what people can afford and what people are using in order to help develop conservation. We also look at our degree of attainment with the renewable portfolio standard. Anytime you're developing rates, you have to kind of keep your eye on the future. And when we're doing our rate design, we have to take a look at the future because the new portfolio standard does require us to increase our renewable portion of our portfolio. Right now we're at approximately 23%. So we're doing very well. We're actually ahead of a lot of our other neighboring utilities. But again, we have to keep that in mind and then take a look at what's going to be out there in the future for us. The other variable that we have, and it's a big variable, is the amount of dollar transfers that are required to the general fund. The city of Glendale utilizes the GWP operation as a way to help provide programs that are needed in many other aspects of the community, and so the amount of the dollar fund transferred to the general fund is taken into consideration in our rate development. Another thing that needs to be kept in mind is the fact that each utility has their own way of doing their rates. Rate design varies from utility to utility, and it would be nice if on a statewide basis that the designs were consistent so that you would have more uniformity and better comparability. Because right now our comparability is basically at the bottom line level. But we as we go forward, when we do rate designs, we will take a look at the various rate designs that are out there with the eye on looking towards conservation. The other aspect is each utility has a different reserve requirement that's set up. That's done on a local basis, and so what we will do, and we continue to do, is to look at our reserve requirements in a part of our rate design. And then finally, our reliance on wholesale transactions. The greater availability of making positive wholesale transactions will help keep the retail rates down. All of these are things that we look at when we're going forward and trying to develop a rate design, which is something that we will be doing in the near future. And I'm going to let Mr. Steiger handle the next slide here.
We will be looking at revising our 5-year strategic plan, actually starting tomorrow, as we've committed to doing each year, which is the right thing to do. There are many things that have changed over the past year. There are many things that haven't changed. So in doing that, one of the things that's critical is to put together a 5-year financial plan, which we will also be doing as part of the revision of our strategic planning process. There are a number of items that will greatly impact our financial plan over the next 5 years, and these are the challenges and opportunities, as Mr. Fox has mentioned. And the first one is mitigation of unfavorable long-term contractual obligations. And we've mentioned that in the past. That has been a significant issue in creating some upward pressure on our rates. The good news is that as of the end of 2009, we were able to buy out the Shoal Canyon contract, which was one of our largest long-term contractual obligations on the negative side. This has already had positive impacts on our rates, as I mentioned previously. We have another contractual obligation that we are currently working on, which we hope to bring to conclusion in the not-too-distant future, which, if we do so, could also have positive benefits in stabilizing and, again, possibly reducing rates. This is a large issue for us over the next couple of years, and will have some impact on how we make rates going forward. The other issues, as shown here, all have an impact that are part of how we will finance GWP's electric division over the next 5 years. Obviously, the AMI project implementation, which is our largest single project, will impact our capital budget dramatically over the next 3 to 5 years. And we've put that in the mix in terms of how we're paying for it. We are very, very fortunate, as you're aware, that we've been able to obtain $20 million in subsidies for that, actually over $20 million in subsidy for that project, which will help us greatly. The attainment of an additional increment of renewable power will also be a challenge for us. The good news, again, is that we're over 20%, which is higher than most of our neighboring utilities. However, it appears that by the year 2020, we will be required, and we expect to commit to a 33% renewable portfolio standard. Again, we are ahead of the curve right now, but we still have a way to go to attain that. So in order to do that, there'll be some considerations on how to do that in the most cost-beneficial manner. And then finally, the last largest issue for us from a financial standpoint is what do we do with our Grayson Power Plant in terms of modernizing it, replacing some of the older units, potentially repowering. There's a number of options, as we've mentioned, that we've been studying for the last few months now to try to come to a conclusion as to what we need to do. And that conclusion will also have financial impacts on our 5-year financial plan. So we definitely have some challenges. We've got some good opportunities, and this is where we're heading on the electric side. So we will be reporting on this over the next year or two as we go along, and you'll have a much better idea as to what the impacts actually mean. But this is what we're working on now on the electric side of the business.
Glenn, there's one more challenge, the possible financial impacts from cap and trade.
Yes.
Do we have any idea of what that might be?
Well, it depends. You know, we've got a large range depending upon what the cost of carbon actually comes out to be, and we just don't know. You know, we estimate $30 a ton, but it could be less, it could be a lot more. You know, we've heard numbers close to $100 a ton. So as you can see, that has a wide range. Worst case, and this is what we are working diligently to prevent, worst case, cap and trade could add as much as 30% to our electric rates. So that would be worst case scenario.
I have a question for Mr. Fox or Mr. Steiger. Obviously, the city transfer is a sizable amount, and that's also an important amount for the city in terms of meeting its budgets. Do you have any sort of comparison with similar cities who have municipal utilities in terms of what amounts they're transferring to city budgets?
Commissioner Armenian, the answer is yes. The final slide of the presentation, I did just today go through and did some analysis with Burbank and Pasadena. I didn't go beyond that. I thought that that question may arise, and so we did put that information together. So we'll be glad to share that with you.
Okay, thank you.
Could we kill the lights, please? Okay, we're going to go on to the water department now at this point. We're going to cover 3 different items: the financial and operational information. We'll talk a little bit about water rates, and then the challenges and opportunities with the water department. In taking a look at the 3-year financial trend for the water group, you can see that the net income is actually as of 2009 was only $1.6 million. However, the margin was 4.1%. If you take a look and compare that to the prior year, it was at 9.8%, so there is some deterioration that's occurred. The major impact is in the operating expenses area. If you notice that it's gone up slightly from 29.9 to 33.5, and that's a result of the debt on the bonds that the city had entered into in 2008 timeframe. So the effect of the bonds had a full year of impact on the 2009 rates, and that's what's caused the decrease in the amount of revenue or the margin that's occurred. In taking a look at the composition of the revenues, you can see that the vast majority, 89% of the revenues generated are from potable water. And that potable water is basically the different sources, primarily it's the Metropolitan Water District water and then our ground well water. But it's the vast majority of the water, and that's a cost that we do have some control over, but a large portion of it we don't have control because we're buying a large portion of that water from the Metropolitan Water District, and we're subject to rate increases that will be subject to much like any other utility. The recycled water sales right now represent 3%, and this is an area that is a hot topic and one that we would like to see increases, and we do have projects on the drawing board to further increase the sales in this particular area. On the expense side, the water production is 60% of it is in the actual generation of the water or the production of the water, and again, it's from the different sources. It's interesting that the transfer to the general fund is 11% of the total expense components, if you take a look at it that way, and then the transmission of the actual transporting of the water is also 11%. In breaking down our customers and taking a look at the different customers in our service territory, you can see that, again, we have a relatively flat mix of customers. So, again, it demonstrates the fact that we're a built-out city and that our customers remain rather constant. 88% of our meters are residential, and it shows that we're basically pretty much consistent when you look at year by year. The volume of water sold is actually showing that if you take a look at the 3-year trend, we're actually selling less water each and every year. What we've done is we've broken it down into the different components. You can see that on the residential side there has been conservations taking place, and it's actually taking place in each one of the components. So it gives, other than the other category, it shows that basically conservation is taking place. We're seeing the same trend for the first 6 months of this year. We're seeing a further reduction in the amount of water being sold. So conservation is taking place, and it's good that conservation is happening, but it also has an impact on our financial bottom line. What we wanted to do here is to graphically depict what we showed you on the prior slide, that in fact that the volume of water sold, and you can see the largest portion of the water again is on the retail side of the business. Very little of it is on the recycled side of the business. Now, if we take a look at our water supply or our water production, where our water's coming from, it's coming from 3 different pieces. 2/3 of it are coming from the Metropolitan Water District, And again, when we look at the water supply, we have to keep in mind that there are allotments that the city has, and if you exceed the allotments, penalties can come into play, and that we are subject to rate increases that will be passed on to us through the Metropolitan Water District. We also receive 29% of our water from our own local groundwater sources that are under the city's control, and recycled water actually produces 5% of the supply. Now what we've done is we've shown a rate comparison of 5 utilities, and we picked our local sister utilities as well as LADWP. And here, if you take a look at the 5 utility average, it's $78.13. And this 22 HCF per month is equivalent to a standard residential home. So if you were having a single-family home, this is about what your electric bill would be. What's interesting to note is, much like the electric side of the business, each utility does things a little differently in how they develop their rates. Some have a capital improvement charge. Pasadena has a capital improvement charge. They're the only one that does that. And LA has just a commodity charge. They haven't broken it out into different components. So when we design our rates in the future, we're going to take a look at these utilities as well as what other utilities in the industry are doing to determine what's the best fit for the city of Glendale that will help produce conservation. And taking a look at from a graphical depiction of the 5 utilities, you can see that there's 2 higher than Glendale, there's 2 lower than Glendale. The 5 utility average is $78.13 per month. And we actually are at $70.33 per month. So on the water side, we're actually less than the 5 utility average. We're 10% best. So we're $7.80 less, which equals 10%. So on the water side, we're actually below the average. When we do the water rates, there's 2 different types of rates we're looking at, the water adjustment rate and the base rate. And much like the electric side, the water adjustment rate is something that's done by administrative action. What we do is we maintain our forecasts and our actual results, and we're going to compare actual results to our forecast. If, in fact, a water rate adjustment is not needed, then we won't do one. And then we will notify the city manager and the finance director that no rate change is needed. This process is done every 6 months. If, in fact, it's been determined a rate increase or decrease is necessary, then what we'll do is, again, we'll do a scenario analysis. And we'll come and take a look at the various different levels that we need to collect to stay within the range on our rate stabilization fund. And then we will then share that with the city manager and the finance director for input. And then ultimately, it will be passed on to the consumers in form of a notice, and then ultimately either a rate change, increase, or decrease will take effect. This process is done once every 6 months. This last rate change or rate analysis was done for effective January 1st. There was no rate change made. The rate change stayed the same. The second form of change that the city has, rate change in our rate analysis, is what's called the water base rate. And this is basically the expense portion, your O&M expenses, your depreciation, and it's taking a look at all the fixed costs to operate the system. And what we do is we take a look at our revenue requirements. Again, we're comparing our forecast to our actual results, and then we're determining whether we need to make any kind of a rate adjustment. If, in fact, we need to do a rate adjustment, then we will share that information with the Commission, City Manager, City Council, and we will get their input before we proceed any further. The next step after that is we would take and perform a cost study, and the cost study would be to take a look at various design changes or options that would be applicable. And we would want to do a design that would induce people to want to conserve. So if you use less water, then you'll pay less. You use more, you're going to pay more. So that would be the next step. The fourth step would be to actually finalize a rate design, That in turn would be shared with the city manager, the commission, as well as the public to get their input before anything would be finalized. And then finally, there would be a rate design that's agreed upon. That would go to City Council and it would become a municipal code amendment. And then finally, you could implement the rate. So it's quite a long, involved process, and this process can take upwards of 6 months or more because there's a lot of public input, there's a lot of input through the commission, and quite often it gets derailed because of the fact that people want to know and understand before we can move forward. So it's definitely a long and complicated process, and it's probably a lot more complicated than was depicted here, but we wanted to be able to show that there are many steps in the process. Now, like the electric side, there are challenges and opportunities for the water side, and I've asked Mr. Pat Hayes if he could come up and share some of those with you.
Before we move forward, I have a question.
Sure.
I noticed the fuel adjustment on the power side is 4.8 cents per kilowatt hour.
Yes.
And what is it for the water adjustment rate? I don't see it in here.
On the water side, our fuel adjustment rate is at 26.414.
26.4 per HCF?
Yes.
Okay.
1.4.
Oh, okay.
1.4.
Okay. Do we have caps for both of these adjustment factors?
To my knowledge, we don't have caps. What occurs is it has to go through an administrative process, and what we do is we have a rate stabilization fund of which we have cash reserves tied to it. So we want to stay within a tolerance level that we don't exceed what our reserve requirement is, and we don't want to drop far below our reserve requirement. So automatically there's if you want to call it a cap, there's a tolerance level that we have to live with. The only way that we would change something is if we went through and modified our overall cash reserve requirement. And we look at the cash reserves on an annual basis, and from there we would make a determination whether we would have to make a rate change either upward or downward.
Okay, thank you.
President Yao, Commissioners, General Manager Steiger, Pat Hayes, Civil Engineer, Water. In the Water Department, we have a number of challenges and opportunities. As noted by Mr. Fox, lower water sales. With water conservation, our water consumption has gone down. We have no reason to expect, in spite of the recent rains, that we will be out of a water conservation scenario in the coming year. So we continue to be delivering less water, have fewer water sales to support the operating structure. Structuring rates to encourage conservation, that goes to the comment Mr. Fox made that each utility structures their rates according to their own particular needs. In this particular case, we have only two-tiered rates. One, the first 1,000 cubic foot, which most people quickly exceed as they move toward their 2,200 cubic foot average, doesn't provide much incentive. It's likely in the next go-around that we should be looking at additional tiers in the rate structures, one or two in the lower range that encourage residential units that are apartment dwellers, and several higher rates in the tiers that further incentivize people to conserve as they start to climb out of the average, the 22. And in actuality, the last year, we've been well under a 10% reduction, so most residents are using around 20 HCF in the present circumstances. Water supply from Metropolitan Water District, the supply is there. It comes with a price. In the last year, we saw a 21% increase. They just approved a 12% increase for the coming year. And we essentially are renting water supply from Metropolitan at an ever-increasing rate. That water is somewhat subject to interruption, particularly from Northern California, as that's been restricted in the last several years, and we expect that to continue. Regulatory compliance is, in fact, something that not necessarily applies to the electric side, but it definitely applies to the water side. We will be spending at least $2 or $3 million in the coming 2 years simply to meet pending regulatory compliance issues, and it may be a bit more depending on the outcome of our preliminary design studies. Supply uncertainty on local resources. A good portion of our flow comes from the Glendale operating unit, and there are a number of challenges in that basin in terms of the water supply that is there, in terms of the constituents that are in it, and potential regulatory impacts that could occur in the next several years. Recycled water, I think I've presented to you earlier a plan for about a $25 million expansion of this system. That presents a tremendous opportunity for the city. It would add 900 acre-feet of supply from local sources, which improves our reliability, but it's a capital-intensive undertaking as well from a rate structure point of view. You've got to buy it now and get the benefit over a long period of time. Groundwater, we have a great opportunity in groundwater in that we have 3,852 or 56 acre-feet in the Verdugo Basin, about 1,200 of which we don't currently have the capacity to pump. We have a new well under construction on Foothill and another one in the Rockhaven area coming up, which should take us very close to our adjudicated rights. The attraction with that is that even though these are capital-intensive projects, the production of water locally is far cheaper than buying it from Metropolitan Water District. AMI implementation is common to both the electric and water side. Our portion of it is pretty much the wholesale change-out of water meters, along with two-way communication with the water meters. With that will come a number of tools, including the ability to help residents see how they are using their water and undertake steps to conserve that water consumption. With it also, new meters generally tend to read more accurately. The ones that are in there now, a third of them are more than 25 years old and likely are very underreporting the flow. And that's part of the last bullet, unaccounted for water in the system. Last year, we have a very low number on unaccounted for water. It's about 6.5%. Industry standard says if you're below 10%, you're on a good trend. 6.5% is not a bad number. We expect to pick up 1 or 2% of that with new metering. But we also suspect and are aware of the potential for theft of service in some of that remaining number. So, again, some significant challenges and opportunities on the water side.
Are there any questions for Mr. Hayes?
Just one question. You mentioned that the recycled water system expansion requires a large capital, obviously uptaking in the beginning. What is that time period where the cost would what is the break-even, I guess, timeline?
Great question. That $25 million would involve 14 projects constructed ideally over the next 5-year period, which would take us into compliance with meeting our strategic plan goals by September 2013. Each of those projects successively is less cost-effective than the one before it, but the overall picture would, given a critical variable is what we expect Metropolitan Water District rates to increase over time. We used a fairly conservative number, 7%. Last year, again, it was 21%. This year, it'll be 12%. The break-even there was about 22 years into the program. So if one were to go and obtain a bond, a 30-year bond, to buy those recycled water service connections, you would pay for it well before the bond has expired.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question. I've been hearing that we were able to save 10% due to conservation efforts last year. On one of your charts, I see a 4% decrease in volume of water sold. Are we having an increase in some other area?
I'm not sure of those numbers.
There's a chart here.
What our chart depicts is year over year. What more recently, what we've been tracking is our last 12 months, which shows a bigger decrease as a result of conservation.
I think the values that were being cited for conservation was for a base year.
Base year is 2006.
Which is a calendar year, by the way, if I'm not mistaken,
Okay.
not a fiscal year.
Okay, yeah, that's what I wanted to know.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of numbers coming from different time
There's a
slots.
shift and then also a different year.
Yeah, our conservation effort began in July of 2009, so we have about 7 months worth of data. We're actually doing more in the 16% overall cumulative savings versus the 2006 calendar year.
Oh, okay, great, thanks.
I have a question which maybe is more correctly directed to Director Steiger. There was this court ruling on water transfers, and it's had effects in various locales. What's going on with Glendale in that respect, if you could elaborate?
Well, we're still looking at the validity of it as it would apply to Glendale.
Yes.
The most significant difference between the L.A. case and Glendale is a charter city and L.A. is not. But beyond that, we're still looking at the various pieces of it.
Okay.
Commissioner Miller, if I may, another significant difference, if you will, is that the LA charter and the Glendale charter are different. And in Glendale, I'm not as familiar with LA, but in Glendale, the transfer was voted on 3 times by the voters, and all of those predate Prop 218, so categorically different from the situation that LA finds itself.
Thanks for that clarification. And I had a question for Mr. Fox. In both the water and power presentations, you had a slide for revenue indicating capital contribution and revenue, and I was a little bit confused as to what that meant.
Capital contribution and revenue means if a developer or a third party builds an item, then they deed it to the city. That would, in essence, be a capital contribution provided to the city.
I see. And then also on your power presentation, you mentioned the city manager is notified of a fuel cost adjustment, but I presume he also approves. He has to approve it. Is that correct?
It's an approval process. We put forth a letter on an every 6-month basis whether there's a change or not, both for the electric and water. If there's an objection, then the change won't go forward.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That's all I had.
Thank you. You have
I just wanted to make a suggestion. Educating the public about rate making is always a challenge, whether you're about to propose an increase or not. Just a suggestion, you may want to make this presentation viewable online for those customers or residents who are interested in getting a closer understanding of this process. Thank you very much for a very informative presentation.
Thank you. I think your suggestion is a very good one, and we are going to put it online on the GWP website for people to view. I do have a couple more slides, though. So
can we hold on? We have 5 minutes left, and we have one speaker request to speak, and that'll take 3 minutes.
Okay,
so
give me 30 seconds on
okay,
each.
30 seconds.
Okay. This one is utility next steps, and we'll let Mr. Steiger go through real quickly, and then I have one I'll go through real quickly.
And I've pretty much covered it. As I mentioned, we are in the process of updating our strategic plan, which will involve an updated 5-year capital forecast. And from that forecast, we will be developing rate structures that will be encouraging conservation both on the electric and water side.
Thank you. And the final is I thought we'd put a little supplemental information. This goes to Commissioner Armenian's suggestion. We took a look at Burbank, Glendale, and Pasadena just to give you some high-point information. If you can see from a revenue standpoint, this is fiscal year ending 2009 information taken from audited financial statements, total revenue of the 3 different cities. For electric revenue, you can see that Glendale is the middle of the 3 different utilities, just slightly above Pasadena. Our city transfer compared to Burbank and Pasadena, as the question Commissioner Armenian had mentioned, we are above the other 2. Our wholesale income is less than the other 2 utilities. This is an area that we're trying to ramp up, and something that is an initiative that, through our strategic planning process, a tremendous amount of effort will be put in this area. If you take a look at our margin is less than the other utilities, but it's a direct reflection related to the transfer that's taking place. And finally, the customers, as you can see, our customer base is larger than the other. We're a larger city, and as we indicated, 85% of our customers are residential. So with that, I finished.
just want to make
go ahead quickly.
one comment about this slide specifically as context. It goes a little bit beyond our scope as a commission, but there are differences between the different cities in terms of property tax revenue, et cetera, which may impact the differences in city transfer as well.
This is one of these types of slides and analysis that there's multiple data points that could be looked at in the future, and I think there's value in doing further comparisons as we go through the process.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to invite Mr. Herbert Milano to speak. We have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, GWP commissioners and staff. My name is Herbert Milano. In 3 minutes, I have to, try to clarify, 45 minutes worth of presentations here. But let me start with one. He continues to mention the 3.3% margin. And I would like to, to see it in the way that we look at, private company finances, which is, before, interest, amortization, and taxes. In this case, I think it should be shown as before the depreciation, amortization, and transfers, and look at that number and repeat it often enough so it can give us a really sense of really what is the actual benefit, net benefit that we're basically bringing out of the utility. There's another misleading situation that you will not see unless you look at the documents that I gave you, which is that other cities charge this, other utilities charge the city what is called a current market rate for the street lighting, like 15 cents per kilowatt hour. But in Glendale, we charge 2/10,000ths of a dollar, to the city of Glendale. So in other words, we are presented. Now, if our goals are to say, look, we're going to structure rates such that they are fair and direct the public towards conservation, then these numbers and residential breakdown at 500 kilowatt hours, per month is, it's a fairly substantial number. I can live on 10 kilowatt hours a day. That's 300 kilowatt hours a month. And when it comes to water, I'm using 80 gallons per day. Less than that for a family of 4, single family. So in other words, if we're aiming so that you're actually, when you look at these incredible rates, that you're using 22 HFC per month, 548 gallons per day, that's how you're going to basically identify the rates and justify the particular rates based upon this. If that's the case, way about it. Low-income residents are subsidizing the usage of water of the high users, because the rates are
pretty much across the board. I taken a look at the bills from my tenants, and basically they show, I'm ready for 40 seconds here. I wanted to bring up a couple of other significant issues that you need to do 10-year comparisons, with the 3 surrounding cities. And look at those documents, Pasadena, Burbank, and Los Angeles, and see them side by side so you can get a real good feel of basically how it is that we're doing. And the other one is, why is it that our wholesale sales are so significantly lower than Pasadena and Burbank? Take a look at that. It's because the rates are so high you can sell it. You can have an increase in wholesale prices if you cannot sell it to the actual public, which tells you that your rates are much higher. And one final thing, if you want to verify your numbers, you just simply take your total kilowatt hours and the total revenue, and you can see the actual overall package, and then compare it to the other cities. Thank you very much.
Well, I think we ran out of time, so is there a motion to postpone those last 3 agenda items into the next meeting?
I move.
Is there a second?
Postpone.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Meeting is adjourned.